or black. A lot to talk about. Ham's AKA the voice of
Hamas has agreed in principle, and Israel is now considering a proposal for the release of at least 50 women and children among about 240 foreign and Israeli hostages being held by Hamas in Gaza. Now, this is according to an Arab diplomat familiar with the negotiations. In exchange for the hostages, Israel would have to agree to a 3 to 5 day pause in the fighting, and they'd have to agree to increase humanitarian aid to Gaza and the release of an unspecified number of women and children held in Israeli prisons. The Israeli military was solidifying its hold on the Gaza Strip's largest hospital today after storming the complex overnight. Soldiers were conducting searches and interrogations inside, and Israeli officers said they had found rifles, ammunition, body armor, and other military equipment in a radiology building. Now, Hamas denies these allegations by the Israeli military. The Biden administration officials are increasingly at odds with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government over how it is conducting its military assault on Hamas and how the two countries envision the political future of Gaza. Amid dire scenes from hospitals in Gaza, including its largest one, and a rising civilian death toll, frustration is building among administration's officials who have repeatedly appealed to Netanyahu and his government to take more action to protect Palestinian civilians and allow more humanitarian aid into Gaza. Donald Trump and his allies are already laying the groundwork for a possible second Trump presidency, forging plans for an even more extreme agenda than his first term. If he wins another term, Trump has said he would use the Justice Department to have his adversaries investigated and charged with crimes, including saying in June that he would appoint a special prosecutor to go after President Biden and his family. He later declared in an interview on Univision that he could, if someone challenged him politically, have that person indicted. A judge on yesterday ruled that Donald Trump, despite all of those claims, can appear on the primary ballot in Michigan. Now, this is a setback to those who contend that Trump, the spark of the insurrection on January 6, 2021, bars him from running for president again. An appeal is expected and can ultimately be resolved by the Michigan Supreme Court or even the U.S. Supreme Court. And the House passed a bill yesterday to avert a government shutdown. Now it moves on to the Senate. Senate leaders say they will take up the legislation as soon as possible to beat the Saturday deadline when federal funds expire. The legislation represents a major compromise for GOP Speaker Mike Johnson, who eschewed calls from the far-right flank of the GOP conference to slash federal spending or add controversial policy provisions that Democrats and some Republicans rejected. And this bill represents a departure from Speaker Johnson, who said he would not ever compromise with Democrats. And we're learning now that it's a lot easier to take that position when you are a relatively unknown congressman from Louisiana and not in charge of the entire Congress and the Speaker of the House. Some Republican strategists say that Republican women are the secret weapon in the fight to maintain abortion rights. And they say that the Ohio ballot measure, Measure 1, is a strong indicator that some GOP women are breaking from the party on key issues such as abortion. This is Areva Martin in Real Time, and I'm your host, Areva Martin. And this is your one-stop destination for today's trending news, expert analysis, and my unfiltered opinions. This is hour 2 of Areva Martin in Real Time, and this is the hour where we go deeper, where we bring you those stories that people are talking about, where we bring on experts who enlighten us on some of those big and important stories. And today, that big story is guns. Oh my God, whether it's a mass shooting or it's the countless numbers of senseless deaths that we see happening on streets of Chicago, St. Louis, New York, Los Angeles, you name it, we have seen young children, teens, innocent victims fall prey to gun violence. And despite the numbers of mass shootings that happen in this country, there is still such an appetite in so many states to enact legislation that makes it easier, not difficult, more difficult or harder for individuals, even some that have proven mental health issues, to have access to guns. We have a conservative Supreme Court that believes that the Second Amendment should be interpreted based on the way the founding fathers, in their opinion, determined that guns at the time should be readily available, that individuals in the U.S. had the rights to bear arms. And you'll hear gun rights advocates often cite to the Second Amendment that talks about a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state, and that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Well, many historians take issue with that interpretation of the Second Amendment, or the interpretation that the Second Amendment gives an unfettered right to citizens of the U.S. to have access to guns in their cars, guns on their person, guns in Walmart. Some historians say that the interpretation of the Second Amendment is just sloppy history and just an inaccurate interpretation of that amendment. And today I'm talking to one of those historians, one of those experts who says that the right to bear arms in the Second Amendment is not so much about upholding the Constitution as it is about upholding white supremacy. Joining me in this hour is going to be Professor Alexandra Filindra. She is a professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago. She's out with a new book, and the book is called Race, Rights, and Rifles: The Origins of the NRA and America's Gun Culture. This book has been described as an eye-opening examination of the ties between American gun culture and white male supremacy. And what Professor Filindra does is she traces those ties back to the American Revolution and brings it forward to today and the gun culture that we see so evident in cities throughout the U.S. I can't wait to talk with Professor Filindra about this book. I've had an opportunity to sit down with Professor Carol Anderson, who's also written an acclaimed book about the Second Amendment and has challenged us to think differently about that amendment and what that amendment really says about race, racism, and anti-Blackness in this country. When we come forward, more on our topic, race, rights, and rifles, with Professor Alexandra Filindra, right here on KBLA Talk 1580.
Age and social justice union was to this daily Pulitzer notable journal.
We are back with Professor Alexandra Filindra. She is at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and she's out with a new book, Race, Rights, and Rifles: The Origins of the NRA and America's Gun Culture. Welcome, Professor Filindra, and thank you so much for joining me. I am always intrigued by authors like yourself and Professor Carol Anderson who take on the Second Amendment and the gun rights advocates, because they are so, I'll use the word, arrogant and self-assured and confident that the Second Amendment gives them this unfettered right to have access to guns, even assault rifles. And we see some of that attitude being displayed or demonstrated by, or manifested, I guess, by our own U.S. Supreme Court in recent decisions by that conservative court. So thank you for challenging some of those notions. I'll just start by asking you, what was your impetus for writing Race, Rights, and Rifles?
Thank you very much for having me, Areva. It's great to be here. My impetus for writing this book was understanding the origins of this political version of gun culture. There are many gun cultures in America. There's a hunting culture. There are sporting cultures, people who like to do gun sports. But there's also this very strong political gun culture that describes democracy as coming from the barrel of a gun. Literally, they say that political elites can become so corrupt and tyrannical that unless the people have firearms to resist them, they have the power to resist them through violence, through force, we can't count on the right to vote. As the NRA calls it, guns should be our first freedom, because unless you literally have a gun to point at elected officials, you can't rely on the right to vote, because it's fleeting. They can take away your right to vote unless you have firearms, unless you have the power to threaten your elected officials. And this ideology seems inconsistent with the way we understand today and practice democracy. We think of voting and of protesting and petitioning the government as the means of expressing democracy. We don't think of going to, a politician's office with a gun and say, do things for me, or basically threaten you or feel that you have to be threatened. So I wanted to understand, where do these ideas come from?
And that's what I was going to ask you, is this thinking on the part of the NRA, is this at the origins of this organization? Is this a part of kind of their, founding mission, their origin story?
Well, actually, it goes way before them, and it's the founding of the American Republic story. It is foundational to the building blocks of America, because in the 18th century, when at the time of the American Revolution, the ideology that drove the building of the Republic was an ideology called martial republicanism. And what this idea was about was that in order to create good citizens, in the sense of citizens who would put the public good ahead of their personal private good, they had to be people who were valorous. They had to be people who were willing to put their lives on the line for the country. They had to train at arms, but not in the private sense, in the military sense. So the citizens had to be good soldiers, and they had to be willing to train at arms in order to be virtuous. And virtue was what was required to be able to recognize the public good and what was corrupt, what politicians were doing that was not consistent with the public good, and then vote in accordance with the public good. In the 18th century, militaries were formed in terms of individual soldiers. We didn't have the technology of the late 19th or the 20th century or the 21st century. So basically, the idea of firearms was in the sense of building the militias of the states. And it was one of the first laws that the US passed after the ratification of the Constitution, was the Uniform Militia Act of 1792, which is often referenced in relation to these decisions. And what this act says is that every white man of military age, 18 to, I think, 45 at the time, is required to serve in the militia. So there was conscription, like it is in Europe in many countries today or in earlier times. All men had to be part of the state militia, and they had to buy their firearms and all the related accoutrements that were necessary for serving in the military, their uniforms, all of these things. And the reason for that was because at that time, the American governments, the states, were broke. This was not a time where they could they didn't have the Defense Department that we have today. They didn't have the budgets that they have today. So essentially, they privatized the cost of creating a military on the cheap to the individual citizens. And they also put the requirements that you had to be enrolled in the militia to be able to vote. Several states in the early republic said, you have to be part of the militia. You have to serve, and you have to be ready to die for the country and be virtuous in order to be a part of the militia. And of course, at this time, this applied only to white men because the ideology of white supremacy was laid over this idea of martial republicanism. And that ideology basically said that African Americans, on one hand, could never be trusted with the public service, with the supporting militarily the country, because they were savages, because they were enslaved and chose basically the dependency of slavery over the death of freedom. They stayed enslaved, and that made them incapable of becoming good soldiers and therefore good citizens. And when at that time, Jefferson was looking at the revolution in Haiti, which was a Black revolution, where the slaves took over the island and established the first Black republic in the world. He was seeing cannibals. He was not seeing revolutionaries like the founding fathers had been 15 years earlier. To him, the exact same impetus, the exact same act, but from Black people had a completely different meaning. And when it came to people who rebelled against white authority within the United States as slaves, that was also savagery. It was never interpreted as an effort to become free. And basically, that meant that African Americans were excluded ideologically and practically from military service, and so were women at the same time.
So what happens, Professor Filindra, when we see the enactment of civil rights legislation, the end of slavery, the opening up of the military, the ability for African Americans to serve in the military? So we see these changes, pretty substantial changes as it relates to how African Americans go in this country from slavery to this period of Reconstruction, then Jim Crowism, the civil rights movement. Does anything change about the underpinnings, this white supremacy that you identify in the 1700s? Are there changes as we're seeing, a recognition that African Americans are not subhuman, we're not second-class citizens, that we are, equal to our white counterparts?
But that's not what happens, because throughout, even though African Americans have fought in every American war, they have fought up until Vietnam. They were kept always in positions of support. So even in the Civil War, you have this very moving speech by Frederick Douglass, where he says, if you wear the pin of the Union Army on your coat, and you have the gun of the Union Army on your shoulder, nobody can deny you your manhood. Nobody can deny you your citizenship. But even within the Union Army, they're not put really into battle. They're put in to dig ditches. In the First World War, you see the same experience. You see W.E.B. Du Bois saying we have to close ranks because African Americans have to fight in Europe against authoritarianism, because after that, surely our rights will be recognized as citizens. Because if we die for this country, we will show our equality. And it yet again doesn't work like that. And so the African Americans actually organized independent militias as of the 1830s, with the Civil War coming, out of their own pockets in Massachusetts, in Ohio, everywhere where there is an underground railroad. This is basically a vigilant societies that militarize to help the escaping slaves, but also because the war is coming, they want to be prepared to fight. And all of this is done with funds from these very poor free Black communities. And after the Civil War, these continue to exist. And they're very big symbolic effort by the African-American community, especially because after the Civil War, you start seeing the evidence of Jim Crow. People are kept away from voting, but this is still a way to reach citizenship, because in this ideology of republicanism, military service is one of the two important parts of citizenship. So they keep using it to prove their manhood, their citizenship. But the American state, the white supremacist American state, takes these units and sends them where? It sends them to the plains to kill Indians. It sends them to Cuba to create American empire. It sends them to the Philippines. So Black soldiers are dying, killing other minoritized people in order to try to break into this white supremacist system that is really not working. And then even in World War II, it took Randolph and attempts to basically threats to have a major march on Washington to order the integration of the military, but it wasn't.
And I guess, no, and I hear what you're saying, and obviously incredible history for all of us to know and about the pervasive nature of white supremacy dating back, as you said, to the 1700s. When we come forward, I want to talk about today's military, in particular, where we have African-American men serving at some of the highest levels in the military, very visible, and some of the overt changes that have happened with respect to the military. How do you explain that in the book as it relates to this gun culture and the supporting of white supremacy when we come forward? More in KBLA Talk 1580. We are back, and in this hour, I'm talking with Professor Alexandra Filindra. She is a professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and she's out with a new book. It's called Race, Rights, and Rifles, The Origins of the NRA and America's Gun Culture. This book has been described as an eye-opening examination of the ties between American gun culture and white male supremacy from the American Revolution to today. All right, Professor, we talked a lot about the underpinnings of the gun culture as it relates to white supremacy in the early 1700s, 1800s. Bring us current to today. So today we have Black men in particular serving at some of the highest ranks in our military. So give us an understanding of how we look at those men and their positions and juxtapose it against this white male supremacy, which is kind of the underpinning of much of our gun culture.
So, yes, the military changed radically, especially in the 60s, both because of the demands of the Vietnam War, but primarily because of the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement pushed very hard for racial integration in the military, and they got it in 1948. And over time, African Americans served in combat positions, which is the real, in quotes, soldier. That's the real thing that soldiers are supposed to do. And also rose in the ranks, especially in the Army. Some of the elite forces, like the Marines, tend to still be a lot more white. But as this was happening, there was another actor organized at the social level and bringing in and maintaining this idea of white supremacy, this idea of martial republicanism mixed in with white supremacy, and that's the NRA. And the NRA typically is thought of as a lobbying group for the gun lobby. But that's actually not what the NRA is or where it comes from. The NRA is a military organization that was established in 1871 after the Civil War by officers of the National Guard who basically believed that the National Guards were so undertrained in shooting that they were completely ineffective. There were lots of reports about the quality of soldiery in the Civil War, and before that, the militia, the state militias, the National Guards were, in the 19th century, were famous for being terrible. And these people wanted an organization that would work as a private contractor, essentially, with the state and federal governments to train the guards and the draft age population, both in shooting and in instilling this ideology of the good citizen soldier who's ready to fight and protect the country at arms. And they managed to get this amazing deal out of Teddy Roosevelt. This is the time where this ideology is reigning. Teddy Roosevelt is himself a former leader of the National Guard. Many members of Congress are members of the National Guard. So the NRA comes to them with the National Guard and say, hey, we want the federal government to give us money to set up ranges and set up shooting competitions, but also in order to create a large membership, we want a deal where you will give us guns and ammunition out of the federal depots for free or at discounted prices for members of our organization alone. And that's what happens. They get this basically special deal where if you're a member of the NRA, you can go to the federal government and get free ammunition and discounted weapons, weapons at discounted prices. And they build a large membership, and they become responsible for training all these people. And it's not just training them in shooting. They are indoctrinating them in this ideology. And of course, this is a federated organization, and most of their members are white. It's very difficult.
But what impact, I guess, Professor, you said they're more than a lobbying organization. I get that, but what impact are they having today? Like when we look at the NRA today, we know they've been weakened, we know they've had a lot of financial scandals, but where are they today?
Their major influence is in having affected how people think about guns and gun ownership, having brought this culture, this political gun culture that understands gun ownership as a political act, as a symbolic showing of signal of good citizenship, and instilling it in a large proportion of the population. Among white Americans today, about 40% think of gun ownership as a sign of good citizenship. And also 56%.
Does that break down, Professor, along political lines, like Republicans, Democrats, or just 40% of all white Americans?
This is 40% overall. Yes, conservatives and Republicans are far more overrepresented in this. And also, of course, what we see is that people with negative views of outgroups, people who have negative views of Black people, people who have negative views of immigrants, also negative views of gender, sexism, tend to express these types of views. And they are far more likely to also own firearms. They are also far more likely to believe, 56% of all whites in 2023 said in the survey that we did that the federal government is so powerful that we need guns to protect ourselves from it. So it is this very fearful culture that fears government and thinks of guns as the way to solve political problems. And again, it skews Republican, it skews conservative, but it is a very large proportion of the white population that holds these ideas, and it goes beyond those who strongly identify with the NRA. So those are the core, but this has spread to a lot more people, a lot more families. And if you take along with that there are 400 million firearms in civilian hands, give or take. And right now, our best estimates, which are based again on surveys, so we don't have hard data on who has firearms and how many, but based on estimates, 77% of all gun owners today are white. That tells you that there is a huge difference. If you think that about a third of the total population or so has firearms, and of those 77% are white, and you divide that by 400 million firearms, that's a lot of firearms on average per person. And we know from the surveys that 10 or more % of people have hundreds of firearms. So there is a very large concentration of firearms in the part of the population that is actually shrinking over time, because the white population is now 59% of the overall American population, and yet they represent 77% at least of gun owners. That in itself is worth thinking about, and what the implications.
Yeah, no, it's definitely worth thinking about. And when we come forward, I want to talk about how these statistics that you just gave us, how do they impact what we see happening at the Supreme Court level around support for more access to guns? And does it suggest that we're ever going to get to what we all think of, or many of us think of, as sensible gun legislation? Stay with us. KBLA Talk 1580.
We've got unapologetic KBLA 1880.
All right, Professor, I'm just trying to make sense of what this means in terms of when we think about sensible gun control legislation. We hear a lot about that, particularly right after there's a mass shooting, and we have so many mass shootings in this country. After there are the standard thoughts and prayers, there's always some conversation about we need sensible gun legislation. But based on what you're saying, is that even, a realistic possibility in this country?
It is incredibly difficult because, first, this ideology took the stamp of the Supreme Court in 2008 with Heller, where Justice Scalia tells us that the able-bodied men of the nation have right to organize in militias to fight against tyranny. So the political right to fight tyranny is now an official constitutional right of each individual of us, which in itself is incredibly problematic because A, why the able-bodied men? And B, who decides and on what criteria, what's tyranny? So that's the one thing. Then we have the Bruin decision last year, which basically tied us to the history and tradition interpretation, which basically says that unless there was a law that kind of resembles what we have today in 1791 or in 1868 when the Constitution was amended after the Civil War during Reconstruction, and there at least a pattern of 3 and not in the West, then basically those laws are not constitutional. A problem that we have with that is like, well, in 1791 and in 1868, there were no airplanes. So what do you do about guns in planes? There were not modern ways of living like we have today. There were no like national parks or local parks the way we have them today. What do you do about trying to restrict gun ownership in public spaces like that? Also, they had muskets and we have AR-15s. We don't have the same kind of technology anymore. The result of that is that the Supreme Court is currently in the middle of the most insane decision that I am sure as a lawyer you have more of an expert opinion than I do. It's the Rahimi decision, where you have a domestic abuser with a long history of violence against both his partners and other people, who has basically shot at fast food workers because they were not fast enough. And because domestic abuse was not a crime in 1791, because actually the laws of the time made wives the property of their husbands, then red flag laws that allow states to take away guns from domestic abusers are null and void, based on this history and tradition logic of the Bruin decision. My understanding as a layperson, not as a lawyer, from the discussion at the Supreme Court is that the justices are desperately seeking a way to pull back so that at least red flag laws will be found constitutional. We don't know how they're going to do that.
Yeah, because you're right. They put themselves in quite a bind with that New York gun decision, which seemingly opened the door and said, unless it was around during the period in which we're talking about the adoption of the Second Amendment, then it can't be used to prevent people from having access to guns. So we can see, if we go down that slippery slope, that would mean people with mental health issues should have access to guns. There just wouldn't be any limitations, and all of the laws and all of the efforts on the part of certain lawmakers, particularly those Democratic lawmakers in certain states like California, there would be no constitutional support for them restricting gun access.
Another really ironic twist to all this, which is also like nonsensical, it exposes the nonsensical construct here, is that if, as the Heller decision says, people have a right to own firearms in order to protect from tyranny, why can't you take firearms into political spaces like the Capitol? Right. If the goal is to basically threaten your elected officials so that they stay in their lane, why are those spaces or courthouses or any other
federal building, yes, or airplanes or any place where you might encounter one of those elected officials, you would be quickly wrestled to the ground, arrested, and charged with some pretty serious felonies, which is, you're just exposing the hypocrisy, right? It's exactly. Not irony, it's hypocrisy.
Correct. It is.
And
yes.
Go ahead.
Exactly. That is the correct word. It is hypocritical. And it is, and it has put us in a very difficult situation. In the meantime, we have an election next year, and our data suggests that what the decision last year allowed is public carry. People now are allowed to bring their firearms into the open space.
Except those places like federal courthouses.
Exactly. But they can bring them theoretically into protests. They can bring them, like it happened in Arizona, to patrol around the ballot deposit box. They can bring them maybe around voting booths or something, or come into a voting booth with their guns. Why not? And the question is, does that produce chilling effects when you know, or you're informed that, hey, other people may be bringing guns to a protest. Other people may be bringing guns to the voting booth or to any other political space, to a town hall meeting. How likely are you to attend those things? How likely are you to vote? And our data that we collected this year suggest that there are significant chilling effects. People are chilled from participating in these political activities.
Right, when they know people have access to guns or are carrying guns.
Exactly.
To this, Professor, do you see different attitudes? Since you gave those statistics about the majority of gun ownership being, concentrated with white Americans, what are the attitudes that Black people have around gun ownership? Because we have seen these groups of like African Americans, gun owners, and we'll see on social media, oftentimes Black groups with rifles and, stating their rights to bear arms as well. But what's overall the general attitude that Black people have around guns and gun legislation?
African Americans is the group that has the highest rate of support for gun control because for many reasons. Their communities are the ones that are most affected by gun crime and by gangs that are armed with stolen guns, with illegal guns. Their kids are the ones that are more likely to die on the street because of gang fights. There is also high levels of domestic abuse within the African American community, and that also affects support for gun control. They're also worried about having a gun on their person, given the police response to that. We have seen on several occasions where police have shot at African American people because they had a firearm on them. The Castillo case in Minnesota, I think, is like the most prominent example of that. And it's the one case that the NRA was completely silent on. But it's basically, even if they own firearms, they're less likely to bring them to the street because they're at much higher risk of dying as a result. So even though a lot of African American men buy into this idea of guns as a sign of good citizenship and this sort of macho ideology of I am showing my manhood and I am being a good citizen in this way, they're less likely to own firearms and definitely less likely to own the types of firearms that whites own because there is an income gap. These bigger firearms, high power firearms are not cheap. And the average African American doesn't have the kind of money that the white suburban middle class guy has to spend on a hobby of collecting multiple AR-15s. So there is a financial difference too.
We are out of time. Such an interesting topic. Thank you so much, Professor, for sharing your brilliance with us. Congratulations on your new book, Race, Rights, and Rifles, The Origins of the NRA and America's Gun Culture. As you said, we have an election coming up, and gun rights and gun control rights are always on the ballot. I highly recommend that everyone pick up a copy of this book leading into next year's presidential election in particular. Again, thank you for spending time with me this evening. The next voice that you hear will be Robin Ayers in the Raw Report right here on KBLA Talk 1580. Don't touch that dial. Thank you so much.
Racist, sports, politics, we do it all. Afternoon show. You are definitely missing the afternoon show. 2 to 4 only on Progressive Talk 15.
Boldly go gone before.
Boldly taking never gone but new vistas. New view, new vision, new victory. We're KBLA and the Black.
Follow the leader. Follow the leader.
Following K80 on all of our missing out, our app, and find Twitter, Instagram, YouTube.